Imagine a world where your crime is so vile, your punishment so horrific, that the only sentence fitting your sin is to be boiled alive. Picture a woman, condemned for crimes against the crown, or for defying society's rules, being lowered into a cauldron of scalding liquid. The agony is indescribable. Your skin bubbling, your flesh dissolving, and the searing heat consuming your body from the inside out. And you're still conscious of every horrific second, every shred of your humanity slipping away with each passing moment. This wasn't some ancient legend or a dark fantasy reserved for the pages of fiction. No, this was a real punishment, one carried out with chilling precision during medieval times. Boiling alive was a fate reserved for the most heinous of crimes. Those who challenged authority, defied the crown, or were accused of crimes like witchcraft, poisoning, or betrayal. And for women who found themselves at the mercy of the crown, this was not just death, it was obliteration, a complete erasure of the person they once were, both physically and spiritually. But why was boiling alive considered a fitting punishment? How could such a grotesque method of execution become an accepted part of Europe's justice system? The answer lies in the darkest corners of history, where fear, superstition, and unchecked power collided, and the lives of the accused were treated as little more than a public spectacle. Tonight, we unravel the dark and forgotten history behind one of Europe's most brutal and strange punishments, where victims weren't just killed, they were obliterated, erased, and boiled alive. The idea of boiling alive was linked to the belief in miasma theory, which held that disease was spread by bad air or corrupt vapors, particularly from water. As a result, water itself was often seen as a cleansing agent, something capable of purging the corruption within the body and society. By boiling the accused alive, it was believed that both the physical and spiritual contamination could be eradicated in a gruesome but effective way. The act of boiling was viewed not only as a punishment, but as a ritualistic cleansing, a final purification. Boiling alive also became a public spectacle, a method of demonstrating the power of the ruling class while simultaneously instilling fear into the population. It wasn't enough to simply execute the criminal in private. These events were meant to be seen by the public as a reminder of the ruler's power and the horrific consequences of defying societal norms. The physical horror of being boiled alive is beyond anything most people can imagine. The condemned would be stripped of their dignity and lowered into a cauldron, filled with boiling water or oil. At first, the victim's skin would blister, the surface bubbling violently, as the liquid seared into their flesh. As the boiling heat consumed their body, the pain was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. Their flesh began to dissolve, skin peeling off in layers, exposing muscle and bone beneath. While they were still conscious, still aware of the agonizing, slow destruction happening to their body, the torment was prolonged. Some victims died quickly, but for many, the agony would drag on for minutes or even hours, with the intense heat eating away at their insides. The body would swell, the skin tightening and disintegrating as the boiling liquid broke down their tissue. Eyes would bulge, organs would start to cook, and the victim would drown in their own blood and bile, all while they were still fully conscious of the hellish death they were enduring. The psychological terror was just as agonizing as the physical pain. Knowing the slow, inevitable fate awaiting them, the victim would be gripped by absolute dread, fully aware that there was no way out. They could only suffer, the searing heat invading their body from the inside out, every nerve screaming as their own flesh melted away. Many would attempt to scream, but the agony would leave them weak and unable to make a sound, their voices being swallowed by the torturous heat. To add to the terror, the bodies of the condemned were often left on display, their once human forms now grotesque, bloated masses of ruined flesh. These horrific remains were placed in public view, intended to serve as a terrifying warning to anyone who dared defy the law. The message was clear: this is the price of rebellion, defiance, or evil. The stench of rotting, burnt flesh would fill the streets, a haunting reminder that, in the eyes of the rulers, the lives of those who opposed them meant nothing but brutal, public obliteration. In the medieval world, this method of execution was not just about death. It was about total annihilation. To be boiled alive was to be erased, not only from life, but from memory itself, with nothing left of the body but charred remains. The power of the rulers was established through this brutal spectacle, where human beings were reduced to nothing more than fuel for an infernal punishment. Agnes Waterford's story is one steeped in false accusations, medieval superstition, and horrific violence. She was a woman in 16th century France, living in a time when fear of witchcraft and the supernatural ran rampant. Accused of being a witch after a series of unfortunate events, the sudden death of a local child, an illness that spread through the town, and the mysterious disappearance of livestock, she became a scapegoat for the community's fear. The mob mentality that gripped the villagers, fueled by their own superstition and ignorance, sought to find a culprit for their misfortunes. Agnes, being a woman without powerful family connections or influence, was easy prey for such accusations. With little evidence beyond the word of local rumors and wild superstition, Agnes was dragged into the court and accused of the unthinkable witchcraft. Once convicted, the punishment was as brutal as it was final: boiling alive. Her execution, like many during that time, was not only a form of justice, it was meant to serve as a public spectacle. The court and the masses gathered to witness her horrific fate. She was forced into a large cauldron, filled with scalding liquid, in front of a watching crowd, many of whom were eager to witness the cleansing of what they deemed evil. As Agnes was lowered into the boiling water, her screams were drowned out by the violent bubbling of the cauldron, as her flesh began to blister and peel away, in the most excruciating manner. There was no escape for her, no hope of mercy. As the liquid engulfed her, the agonizing pain of her skin and muscles being burned alive, all while she was fully conscious of every second, is unimaginable. The public, who once stood by in anticipation of her demise, likely watched in a mixture of fear and sick fascination, all believing they were witnessing divine justice. For those who truly believed in witchcraft, her death was seen as an act of purification, a form of spiritual cleansing of the taint she was believed to have brought upon the community. After her death, her body was left on display, her charred remains becoming a warning to any others who might dare defy the superstitions that ruled the land. This public spectacle served to solidify the power of the church and the rulers who used fear and superstition as a means of maintaining control over the people. Agnes Waterford's final moments, slow, torturous, and utterly unjust, exemplified the devastating consequences of paranoia and the twisting of truth into something grotesque. In the end, Agnes was remembered not for any crime, but for her tragic fate, boiled alive due to false accusations rooted in fear and ignorance. The bloodshed and horror of her death would remain a dark stain on history, a reminder of how superstition, unchecked power, and public humiliation can drive societies to commit unspeakable acts in the name of justice. Jeanne de la Motte's case is another chilling example of the brutal justice meted out to those accused of treason during medieval times. Jeanne, a woman of the French nobility, was accused of plotting against the French crown in a political scandal that would eventually lead to her execution. She had been involved in a treasonous scheme that threatened the royal family and, more specifically, the authority of the French monarchy. She was accused of conspiring to undermine the king's power, using her position to manipulate affairs of the court and work against the king's will. Her alleged actions, though politically driven, was seen as a grave threat to the stability of the kingdom. In a world where power and authority were absolute, treason wasn't simply a political act. It was viewed as an assault on the very fabric of the state. In an age dominated by brutal means of control, public execution was not only a form of punishment, it was a political tool used to intimidate and deter anyone who might dare challenge the authority of the crown. Jeanne's punishment was boiling alive, a method chosen not just for the severity of its pain, but for its public spectacle. The French monarchy, like many others at the time, wanted to send a message: anyone who betrayed the crown would suffer a fate far worse than death. Total destruction, both physically and symbolically. Boiling alive was not only about eliminating the traitor. It was about destroying their very being, reducing them to nothing. The terrifying message was clear to all who watched Defy the Crown, and this will be your end. Jeanne de la Motte's death, like many before and after her, was the ultimate symbol of royal authority and control. It wasn't just her life that was taken. It was her identity, her dignity, and any shred of humanity that had once been attributed to her. In the eyes of the crown, this was not simply a punishment. It was a lesson, a reminder that treason against the crown would not only cost your life, but would also consume your very soul in the most violent, degrading way possible. Margaret de la Motte's tragic tale is yet another haunting example of the brutality of medieval justice. Accused of poisoning a high-ranking nobleman, Margaret found herself at the mercy of a ruthless and unforgiving royal system. In a time when political rivalry and the slightest misstep could result in catastrophic consequences, she became a pawn in the larger game of power and manipulation. Her crime, allegedly using poison to rid herself of a powerful rival, was seen as one of the ultimate forms of treason in the eyes of the crown. Margaret's fate was sealed, not just by her crime, but by the very nature of the medieval judicial system, which used public execution to make examples of those who challenged the status quo. The punishment for such a crime, boiling alive, was reserved for the most heinous and publicly humiliating acts. By boiling her alive, the ruling powers made it clear that not only would they eliminate their rivals, but they would do so in the most agonizing and publicly visible way possible. During the witch trials that ravaged medieval Europe, thousands of women were accused of practicing witchcraft, often with little to no evidence. In a time when superstition and fear of the supernatural ruled, being accused of sorcery was a death sentence. The boiling alive punishment was one of the most terrifying fates that awaited women who were accused of casting spells or consorting with the devil. Boiling alive was a particularly gruesome method used to punish women who were accused of witchcraft. These women were often seen as dangerous threats to society, their very existence threatening the natural and religious order. The punishment was not only about execution. It was meant to be punitive and ritualistic, a way to rid the world of evil in the most horrifying manner. Many women were accused of witchcraft due to trivial reasons, such as social envy, personal grudges, or the misfortune that befell their neighbors. The accusation alone was enough to condemn them, as witchcraft was seen as a crime against God, punishable by death. In the midst of the witch trials, some of the most harrowing executions involved boiling alive. The method was seen as a fitting punishment for the most egregious offenses. Those accused of casting deadly spells or committing sacrilegious acts. To be boiled alive meant complete destruction, not just of life, but of one's very essence. Women accused of witchcraft were subjected to this gruesome fate as part of a public spectacle intended to demonstrate the power of the church and the severity of challenging the natural order. The toll of the witch trials was devastating for women across Europe. Many were accused with no evidence other than rumors, personal vendettas, or the fear of society. Some were burned at the stake, others hanged. But boiling alive was seen as a particularly horrific punishment, a way to eliminate evil through pure physical obliteration. The public nature of these executions ensured that the message was clear: to challenge God's order would result in a death so brutal, so agonizing, that it would deter others from ever considering defiance. As many as tens of thousands of women were subjected to brutal fates during the witch trials across medieval Europe, with the boiling alive punishment being reserved for those accused of the most severe crimes. The fear of witchcraft fueled countless deaths, and the boiling cauldron became a symbol of the injustice, irrationality, and inhumanity that characterized the dark days of the witch hunts. Each execution, especially those carried out through boiling, was a testament to the terror that ruled over Europe, with no mercy given to the innocent victims. These women's names are often forgotten or lost to history, their lives reduced to nothing but whispers of suffering and torment. The boiling alive death was a horrifying end for those caught in the crossfire of superstition, fear, and power. A terrifying reminder of how, in the past, women's bodies were used as both scapegoats and instruments of fear. The death toll was massive, but the psychological toll was equally grave. Leaving behind the haunting spectre of lost lives in the name of religious purity. Reflecting on the gruesome fate of the women who faced boiling alive, we are forced to confront the terrifying extremes that history has witnessed. The cruelty and terror that fueled such torturous deaths shed light on how fear and superstition shaped entire societies, where reason and justice were thrown aside in favor of punishment and control. These women became scapegoats, victims of a world where their bodies were consumed by the very forces they feared. Terror ruled these societies, and to question the crown or religious authorities was to risk an agonizing death. The harsh punishments inflicted upon those accused of witchcraft, treason, or defying the powers that be served as chilling reminders of how absolute power can pervert even the most basic sense of humanity. The public spectacles of boiling alive and other forms of execution served not only as a form of punishment, but as tools of fear, meant to subdue the population and reinforce the authority of those in power. Nero's reign of terror, the medieval witch hunts, and the fear-driven punishments that followed show us just how far humanity can fall when superstition and paranoia take hold. The twisted logic behind these punishments highlights the darkness of a time when savagery and inhumanity were dressed up as justice. History's dark moments remind us that power, once unchecked, can lead to unspeakable horrors. The twisted logic and terror behind such punishments remind us that history is dark, and we must remember it.